Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Devin Grammon, Assistant Professor of Spanish Sociolinguistics and an affiliate of the Spanish Heritage Language Program in the Department of Romance Languages at the University of Oregon. Devin specializes in critical, ethnographic, and functional approaches to language and language learning. His most recent peer-reviewed publications are featured in Applied Linguistics, Heritage Language Journal, and L2 Journal. As a 2023-2024 Oregon Humanities Center Faculty Research Fellow, he's working on a project titled Spanish in the Linguistic Landscape of Eugene, Oregon. Thanks, Devin, for coming on the show. It's good to have you with us.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
So first of all, tell us about your background and how you wound up being interested in language learning and sociolinguistics.
Great question. I'm originally from Western Kansas and Southern Colorado, so I did not grow up in a Spanish-speaking household. And so my pathway into Spanish, into sociolinguistics, I guess started in high school. Started taking Spanish, continued in undergrad, and really just loved it. I loved having fun with Spanish, and I had great study abroad experiences. It was through Spanish that I got interested in sociolinguistics. And sociolinguistics is really about the study of language, culture, and society. There are a lot of different approaches. I'm a sociocultural linguist, which means I take a more interdisciplinary approach in terms of theory and method. And I think it was really in the connections that I made with people over time that I became interested in being a sociolinguist. And of course, I think studying Spanish, studying linguistics was really about learning who I was, about learning some of the intricacies around language that that I think all of us think about from time to time, but maybe haven't actually studied or thought a lot about. And it was really through Spanish that I came to linguistics and sociolinguistics. And if you'd asked me 20 years ago, would I be sitting in this chair? Absolutely not.
So what are the kinds of ideas that sociolinguists, like, what are you looking at when you do your research? What are the questions that you're asking?
Yeah, great question. I have a few key ideas that guide my research. So language is social practice, language is about people, and language learning is inherently social process. So the idea of language being social practice is really about the idea of language as social action. So we do things with language. And the way that we use language, right, is also very tied to our identity and who we are and our sense of self and sense of community. The idea of language being about people is really just that. Oftentimes in linguistics, when we study language, we like to talk a lot about what a language does or what linguistic features do. And I think we miss sight oftentimes of the fact that, no, this is about what people are doing, and this is about people's lives and their communities and their connections with others. And that also goes to the idea about language learning being an inherently social practice, because we like to think oftentimes about language learning as something that happens in the mind, right, in the body. And it's really through our interactions with others that we learn.
Really fascinating. So one of your research projects looks at language learning among students studying abroad in Southern Peru. So how did you get to that, and what are you doing in that project?
This is my main research project, and it's one that I started over 10 years ago now in Cusco, which was tied to my own learning of Spanish, but also Quechua, which is an indigenous language spoken in the Andes. In this project, what I'm really interested in is understanding how study abroad students, mostly Spanish learners, Quechua learners, are learning these languages kind of in social and cultural context. But we might think about this in terms of a broader question about study abroad. So we know that study abroad is really important for acquiring skills and competency in a second language or a heritage language. And there's a lot of research that looks at that. So I'm interested in how students are learning a dialect of Spanish, which is in contact with Quechua, and a dialect of Spanish that we might think of as a non-prestige variety, in the sense that this is a dialect of Spanish that is often symbolic of a racialized identity in the Andes, and one that oftentimes, linguists and others describe in kind of deficit terms. So comparing it maybe to an idealized standard from Spain, or even maybe from Colombia, that the way that speakers speak this dialect is somehow inferior or deficient. And so in this project, what I look at is how learners are learning about and acquiring features of this dialect at the same time that they're also learning to categorize kind of the host society. So who lives in the society, where the different types of people, how they're connecting those identities with linguistic features and practices. And ultimately, what I look at in this project is learners' development of sociolinguistic competence. And what that describes is their knowledge of appropriate language, so contextually and socially appropriate language. So what are their ideas about the local dialect, how it connects with different types of speakers and social contexts. And what I look at in this project isn't just the learners and kind of their process, but also the other people who are teaching them. So the teachers, the host families, the roles of different study abroad administrators. And so in this project, I look at different kind of aspects of that learning process from different perspectives.
Tell us a little bit about your research methods. What are you doing?
I am an ethnographer, so I use linguistic ethnography as kind of the way that I conduct this research. So there's a lot of participant observation, a lot of interviews, recordings of conversations, classroom discourse, and whatnot. So it's a kind of ethnographically informed analysis of different types of data, mostly discourse, so recorded classroom discourse or interviews or other types of conversation. Different types of discourse analysis, so critical discourse analysis is one that I bring in as well. But in terms of my larger research, I also do quantitative analyses of linguistic features in interview data. But the kind of main grounding of my research is linguistic ethnography.
So you mentioned that this Spanish dialect that the students are learning, it's involved with prestige, that is to say. Yes. So say a little bit more about what your research has discovered about the relationship between language variation and questions of race and racism, or class and classism.
One of the big findings to come out of my research is that, perhaps not surprisingly, learners are taught the local dialect of Spanish kind of in relation to this racialized Quechua-speaking identity, one that's kind of understood to be indigenous, but at the same time, linguistically deviant and deficient. And this comes out, for example, in the classroom through things that teachers say, stories that they tell, things like that. And learners acquire this knowledge as a kind of ideology, a language ideology. And then in turn, they draw on those ideologies to interpret kind of the social use of linguistic features in Cusco from the local dialect, but also to assess the competence of local speakers. So the idea here would be that if a learner speaking to someone from the host society perceives these features, they oftentimes say, oh, they must be a Quechua speaker. They must not speak Spanish well because their first language is Quechua. And so race really orients a lot of how learners are exposed to and acquire and interpret the local variety of Spanish in Cusco. And that's what I find in my research. Ethnographic methods privilege participants' understandings. And so what I'm really after in a lot of this research is understanding how the students' perspectives are changing over time, how they understand the way that language works in the host society. And then, of course, the perspectives of the teachers, the host families, the administrators in the programs.
Are you finding that these study abroad students are sort of winding up subscribing to this ideology, or do you find that they have a critical relationship to it?
It's a great question. I think two things are going on. So on the one hand, students are quite critical of issues surrounding race in the host society. But one of the things that we see so often is that criticality kind of ends at language.
Interesting.
So the students don't necessarily apply that critical lens to their own language learning. And so they oftentimes are adopting these kinds of ideologies and ways of understanding and knowing without being all that critical about it, though they may be very critical in other ways. For example, the ways that the study abroad program structures their interactions with Indigenous people, for example, in the host society, or maybe certain policies around host families that intersect with race. So while they have seemingly a lot of awareness at that level, when it comes to the language level, that's not the case. And so what I really find in this research is that in the context of a study abroad program, which is about Indigenous people, and it's about learning about and celebrating kind of the contributions of Indigenous people to Peruvian society, students are, through language learning, being socialized to discriminate against Indigenous people.
So why do you suppose that critical consciousness stops at the boundary of language? Have you come up with any theories about that or any evidence for that?
It's a great question as well. I think there are different ways that we can think about it, but I think part of this comes back to how we're socialized starting as children to think about language. We often like to think about language, right, in kind of idealized, standardized terms. And we think of English, for example, as something that anyone can acquire and develop kind of advanced competency, at least as a child. And so everyone has kind of equal access to this education and these abilities. And so someone doesn't speak that way, it's seen as some kind of personal failure or whatnot. So these kinds of ideologies, I think, are involved definitely in how people think about language and race. But I think it comes back to the fact that through our education system, we oftentimes aren't having these explicit discussions either. And while we do have them in other areas, as happened in many of these study abroad programs, it kind of ends at language. And so there are steps that kind of need to be taken, and that I identify through my research that would better address these kinds of issues.
Really interesting. So one of the things I've been interested in researching your research is your kind of skeptical or critical view of the term native speaker.
Right.
So tell us about that. What's wrong with that term? Why is that a problematic term?
Well, right now in the field of applied linguistics, sociolinguistics, linguistics, we're having a bit of a reckoning around a lot of the key concepts that have guided our field for a long time. And part of that is acknowledging the ways that race and racism are implicated in linguistics as a field that has been certainly, trying to think of the right words here to say, certainly comes out of, let's say, a tradition that's steeped in colonialism. And native speaker is one of these terms that we've really come back to and thought more about as a field, I think, in two ways. So on the one hand, it's vague. So we all have an idea of who's a native speaker, but when it comes time to identify who's a native speaker, when it comes time to say, okay, a native speaker is this, this, and this, I think it begins to really lose its meaning. And we see the way that this happens, for example, in who we identify as a native speaker of Spanish. So heritage speakers are usually excluded under the idea that their bilingualism or their lack of education or some other factor makes them less than ideal speakers of a language. And of course, native speaker is an ideal speaker. And of course, there's a huge body of literature that looks at this in English. And I think most of the critiques of native speaker have come out of research that's focused on English and English language learning and whatnot. And so while native speaker is vague, it's also harmful. And it's harmful in the ways that we identify research participants and especially exclude them. And also in the way that kind of this idea of native speaker competence is baked into a lot of the methods and theories that we use in linguistics and in applied linguistics. And so the project that I started with Anna Babel that looks at native speakerhood is one that I think came out of, on the one hand, our larger interest in what it means to be a speaker of a language. So within our society, I think the dominant way that we really think about this is in terms of native versus non-native. I think that's common across Western Europe as well. And certainly in Latin America, you see that too. So on the one hand, what it means to be a speaker of a language, and I think on the other hand, the fact that a lot of these debates have really boiled down to this larger question of, okay, so what do we do now that we know native speaker is problematic in various ways? Some people have said, okay, we need new terms that we should use that are more appropriate and more specific. But I think that is still sidestepping this larger question that we're interested in, which is, what does it mean to be a speaker? What does it mean to be an ideal speaker? And so in this project, we drew on our combined decades of ethnographic research, Peru, and in Anna's case, in Bolivia. And we went back over a lot of interviews, and I did some more too. And what we're really after is understanding how Quechua speakers in Peru and Bolivia conceptualize what it means to be a Quechua speaker, so what it means to be an ideal speaker. And so we identify through our data several different ways in which they conceptualize what we call speakerhood in ways that contrast with, I think, the native speaker construct that we've inherited in linguistics, which comes out of a tradition of ethno-linguistic nationalism and colonialism. So just to highlight a few of those differences. So on the one hand, while a native speakerist kind of approach would say, okay, an ideal speaker is a monolingual speaker of a language, an ideal speaker of a language. And we definitely talk about native speakers in monolingual terms. For Quechua speakers, being bi or multilingual is what it means to be an ideal speaker of Quechua. What's interesting in combination with that is that monolingual speakers are often pitied by Quechua speakers for various reasons. And so they're seen as kind of not ideal representatives of what it means to be a Quechua speaker. Another way that this is a bit different relates to how they think about what Quechua is in terms of relationships. So while the idea of the native speaker kind of comes out of a tradition where we locate language as kind of an individual competence in the mind, Quechua speakers see it as being intimately bound to their social relationships, and especially their intimate relationships, intimate partners, family, children. So while that seems very similar to the idea of mother tongue, which definitely is one of these ideas that leads to the native speaker, it's a bit different in that sense of where language is located in social relationships and interaction versus in the individual mind as a kind of competence developed in childhood. And so there are other ways that we've identified differences as well. Another big one that's important to sociolinguistics is how Quechua speakers understand and think about variation in Quechua. So variation in terms of variable practices across communities and social groups. Quechua speakers tend to interpret that variation in terms of individual differences or community differences. Rather than what's common in our society, we think about them in terms of differences in, say, gender or sex or class or race and these kinds of broader categories. So what that involves usually is a comparison to a kind of idealized native standard. And because Quechua speakers view their language differently in that way, that kind of comparison doesn't happen.
Really, really interesting. So you mentioned that one of the ways this gets played out in the U.S. is with heritage Spanish speakers.
Right.
So you are an affiliate of UO's Spanish Heritage Language Program. First, why is a heritage language program important? Why do we need a heritage language program at the University of Oregon?
We need this program in order to best serve our students. Students who study Spanish fall broadly into two categories, and their needs are quite different when it comes to language learning. There are people who, like me, learn Spanish as a second language starting in high school or in college. And they're oftentimes coming in with very limited knowledge of Spanish. And then we have heritage learners who overwhelmingly are US Latinos who learn Spanish to varying degrees at home or with family. And when they arrive in our classes, right, they're already oftentimes proficient in Spanish. They have a lot of knowledge, but they don't necessarily have the same knowledge as someone who's an L2 learner who learned all the metalinguistic terminology and who knows the conjugations in and out. But what our heritage learners have oftentimes, for example, is pragmatic knowledge of the language, a lot of intuitive knowledge. And so having this program allows us to best serve those students in terms of their language learning goals. And also it comes back to the fact that Spanish language education in the US for so long has served L2 learners as kind of their primary stakeholders. And so much of what we've done has really been about helping those learners achieve native-like competency, while heritage learners are kind of set aside and oftentimes, through the kinds of methods and theories that we employed, end up being positioned as deficient, as deviant Spanish speakers whose knowledge and practices really aren't valued and seen as a problem.
Even though some of them are fluent in Spanish.
Even though some of them are fluent. And of course, there's a lot that we could go into in terms of details, but what I'm really excited about in terms of what we do in Romance Languages in the Spanish program is that we've really thought about how many of the key principles that guide our approach to teaching heritage learners can also be applied to teaching our second language learners, because we have a lot of classes at the upper levels that combine these two different populations. And kind of really at the center of that is the idea of critical language awareness. And we want learners to develop an awareness of the ideologies, the attitudes, right, that accompany what it means to be a Spanish speaker in the context of the United States, so that they can navigate those and advance their own goals.
So I mentioned that you're an affiliate of the HSL program. So what does that mean? What do you do? What does an affiliate do? I mean, you've said you are not a Spanish heritage learner. Right. So what do you do in the program?
What I do in the program mostly is provide support to the faculty who teach these classes, and then there are different types of support that I can provide. But I also teach these learners who come out of this program at the upper level. And so that's really been kind of at the center of my role in supporting the program. I'm in regular conversation with our SHL faculty and keep up to date with what they're doing and help in terms of events that they plan and organize. But mostly I'm focused on making sure that the learners who come out of this program are included in upper level courses that I teach in ways that support them in addition to the L2 learners.
So tell us a little bit about the research project that you have been working on as a fellow at the Oregon Humanities Center.
Absolutely. In addition to the research that I've done on study abroad and the native speaker construct, I've also been involved in creating a research project with my students as part of a class that I teach, which is on linguistic landscapes. Linguistic landscapes is an area of research that focuses on the use of languages on public signage, although it now encompasses much more than that as well, especially in the digital age. And the class that I developed is a class that is a 400, 500 level class that's really meant to invite students, especially undergraduate students, into the research mission of Romance Languages in our Spanish program, and to provide them with experience conducting applied sociolinguistics research that has the potential to inform public policy and, of course, is public facing. And so what's exciting about this research is that I get to work with students. We go out, we do field work. We've, in certain iterations of this project so far, we've conducted interviews. And together we analyze data, we interpret data, and we think about how our findings lead to specific recommendations for how to create Spanish language signage in the local community that aligns with the goal of making more, let's call them welcoming, equitable public spaces where Spanish speakers feel welcome, where they feel that they can speak Spanish, be themselves, and participate fully in our local community.
So when you presented this work at the Humanities Center a few weeks ago, you know, I went in there and I was thinking, what's the problem? There are these signs in Eugene, they're bilingual. Isn't that being welcoming? What are some of the problems that you found when you started to check out these signs that are around town that are bilingual signs?
The project started with, of course, a bigger problem, which was one that was identified also by folks who work at the city of Eugene, and that is that Spanish speakers tend to avoid downtown Eugene. They don't necessarily feel very welcome there. They feel oftentimes, and they've expressed this in interviews too, exposed. And this just isn't a welcoming place where they want to be. And this happened at the same time that the city has made an effort to promote bilingual signage. And so you go to downtown Eugene and you look around and you will find Spanish. And in fact, in many ways, Eugene is a leader in terms of cities who've really pushed for more bilingual signage. But part of the problem here comes back to, okay, so how is Spanish represented? What are differences in how it's visible on different types of signs? And how does the signage in downtown Eugene help to construct this public space, perhaps also as one that isn't so welcoming, and one where negative attitudes towards Spanish speakers are communicated and transmitted? And so what we've done in this project is take a look at all kinds of different variation in these signs, everything from where they are, different types of functions that these signs have, different types of textual representations of Spanish, so font color, size, and we find different types of patterns. And we think about how those patterns relate to downtown Eugene as a type of public space where US Latinos and others from minoritized language groups might not feel so welcome, might feel exposed, under surveillance, where their behavior is kind of positioned as deficient, deviant, in need of monitoring. And so the project has looked at many different aspects of that. For example, we look at different translations of signs. One of the most prevalent signs we see in downtown Eugene, of course, is no trespassing. There are different ways that that's translated, and those different translations can communicate other types of messages as well. So we translate it literally as do not enter illegally. Right, this is foregrounding something about illegal behavior in policing in a certain way versus posting, instead of no trespassing, private property. Another aspect of this would be how a lot of the signage that is prohibitive in nature, so telling people what not to do, telling people that their behavior is being watched by video camera, treat Spanish and English equally in terms of size, representation, visibility. Whereas signs that are oftentimes more welcoming, like welcome to downtown Eugene, these kinds of things, Spanish is smaller than English, harder to see. In fact, a lot of people say, I've walked by this sign 100 times and I've never noticed that Spanish is on it. So all of these kinds of nuances are what we study in this class. And this has led up to, in the first iteration of the class, a meeting, a public meeting of sorts that we had over Zoom, it was during the pandemic, with city employees where we shared our findings and recommendations. And what's been exciting is that over time we've seen how those recommendations have already begun to be implemented in the creation of new signage.
Humanities research matters.
It does, very much.
So, Devin, we're coming up on the end of our time, but let's talk a little bit about your teaching.
All right.
So, as a sociolinguist, what's special about the way you approach teaching?
I think that this comes back a bit to some of the core ideas that guide my research. So when I'm teaching, I want my students to be socialized into being Spanish speakers, and I see that really about an orientation towards Spanish. So speaking Spanish, listening to Spanish, being in communication with others. So a more practice-based kind of understanding of speakerhood, if you will, than the native speaker kind of idea of, well, what you're really chasing here is this idealized perfect competence of a native speaker. I want my students to be active members of society who care about linguistic diversity, and they're ready to engage with social, cultural, racial difference. And of course, the idea of critical language awareness, right, is central to that. So what I think is different about how I go about teaching is that I really want to socialize my students into being active members of society who care about Spanish, who want to speak Spanish, and engage with others. I do that through a variety of means. So we do a lot of different types of activities, but also through research. And I think that's why the class that I described to you is so important. Getting students out there, engaging with others, and thinking about how what they've been learning kind of all along connects to a larger picture where they feel agency and being able to make a difference.
Well, on that optimistic note, I want to thank you, Devin, for taking the time to speak with us. It's been really an interesting conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I've been speaking with Devin Grammon, Assistant Professor of Spanish Sociolinguistics and an affiliate of the Spanish Heritage Language Program at the Department of Romance Languages at the University of Oregon. Thanks so much for watching.